From now on, you're unnecessary, so we're getting a divorce today. Thanks for playing housekeeper, even though you're just a stranger to my dad." While saying such cruel things to me, who had worked so hard, Stanley sneered. Was I really unnecessary? Even after I had devoted myself to my in-laws? Unforgivable. I will make him regret wasting my 20 years. My name is Sophia, and I'm 42 years old. After an office romance, I married Stanley, who had a history of divorce, and a daughter, Nancy, whom I was told about beforehand. She was only 6 at the time, and it wasn't easy for her to accept a new mom. While working every day, I thought of ways to get along with her, and even paid attention to my appearance to seem more approachable. Although she wasn't quite attached to me, my efforts bore fruit, and she agreed to our marriage. I asked her to be a flower girl, and we had a modest church wedding. I was so happy that my efforts paid off, I couldn't help but cry. Upon marrying, Stanley strongly pleaded for us to live with his parents. It was essentially like being asked to take on caregiving. I was still young, hadn't enjoyed newlywed life, and couldn't accept living with his parents right away, so I refused. But then he threatened divorce if I didn't agree to live with his parents. After all my efforts, I couldn't let it all go to waste, and reluctantly accepted. Since then, I lived like a slave. Stanley's father, Henry, was ill, and couldn't live alone. He needed help moving around, and his meals had to be soft. I was even tasked with his bathroom needs. Who would willingly care for a non-relative? But Henry always smiled and thanked me. "Thank you, Sophia." And his smile kept me going. Even though Elise, Stanley's mother, was there, she left everything to me once I arrived. Not just Henry's care, but all the housework too. I hustled around the house, cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry. There were days my body couldn't keep up. Then Stanley made an outrageous request. He wanted me to legally adopt Nancy. At that time, she was still not warm to me, running away whenever we crossed paths in the living room. She had approved our marriage, but I was sure she still disliked me. I pleaded to respect her feelings, but Stanley wouldn't listen. I kept asking her, "Is this what you want?" But she, like a child who never defied her father, just agreed. I wish she had given it more thought, but no one would listen to me, and I had no choice but to go through with the adoption. Nancy, initially fearful of me, matured over time. Even in her rebellious phase, she stayed by my side, calling me Mom. She started helping with Henry's care and housework when I was busy. "Nancy, you're such a sweetheart." She kept Henry company, and he would joyfully say, "Sophia, this part is dirty." One busy day, Elise, my mother-in-law, deliberately pointed out a spot and complained. She never lifted a finger but was quick to criticize. Knowing arguing was futile, I simply said, "Sorry," and re-cleaned the spot. To be honest, my love for Stanley had cooled, and I wouldn't have minded a divorce. But I was concerned about Henry and Nancy and chose a life as a slave in this house. 20 years after becoming a slave in this house, Henry's condition suddenly worsened. I called for an ambulance, but it was too late. Henry passed away, with us by his side. "Grandpa, Grandpa," Nancy cried, lying on the bed where Henry slept. All I could do was stroke Nancy's back as she cried. Henry had died. And while Nancy was mourning, Stanley pretended not to know. Worse, he and Elise were happily discussing the inheritance they'd receive, fully aware that we were there. Despite many unpleasant memories, Henry had always watched over Nancy and me with kindness, so to properly say goodbye, I attended his funeral. Sniffling could be heard everywhere. Henry was a gentle and kind man, loved by those around him. He would sometimes invite friends over for relaxed chats, or be surrounded by relatives during year-end and New Year's events. Everyone who spent time with Henry was always smiling, making it clear he was a man loved by all. That's why many mourned his passing. Meanwhile, Stanley and Elise were secretly discussing how to divide the inheritance and the amount of property Henry had. Disgusted by their behavior, I still made sure to say my proper goodbyes. As the funeral ended, Stanley, with a victorious smirk, declared, "You're unnecessary now, so we're divorcing today. Thanks for playing housekeeper to a mere stranger." I was stunned, not fully grasping his words. "Oh, And Nancy can leave with you too. How could he treat his own daughter so cruelly? Nancy clenched her hands, holding back tears. Unforgivable. Not just wasting my 20 years, but treating his blood daughter Nancy like this? But I had a secret plan. Hey, ever wonder why I endured all of this for 20 years? Let me tell you the reason. Huh? Stanley and Elise were dumbfounded. Despite their harsh words, I smiled broadly. To an onlooker, my smile must have seemed eerie. But considering what they were about to face, I couldn't help it. One reason was to protect Nancy. I couldn't bear the thought of such a good child being manipulated by people like them. I held her trembling hand as a sign of reassurance. It's okay, I wanted to convey. I truly wanted to be Nancy's mom. For that, I'm grateful. Thank you. And there's another reason. I've been entrusted with Henry's will. A will? They clearly hadn't expected Henry to prepare a will. Naturally. Since our marriage, I was the one closest to Henry. In full view of everyone, I opened the will I had been entrusted with. Elise and Stanley began to tremble in panic as they saw the contents. The will, in summary, stated that the house Henry built would be mine. The rest of the property would be divided between Nancy and me. And Stanley and Elise were to inherit nothing. This is nonsense! Stanley began shouting. His loud voice in the midst of the attendees naturally drew curious onlookers. Stanley, what's the matter? An elderly man, drawn by Stanley's shouting, approached us. CEO? Standing there was the CEO of Stanley's company. He was also a good friend of Henry's, often seen visiting our house. Noticing our dispute, he had come over. Shouting at a wife who had devoted herself to your family. Don't you find that embarrassing? No, it's just, my wife is being unreasonable. That's tough. She worked so hard, and yet you don't seem to value such a wife. Sophia is a kind and intelligent woman. To shout at her, especially at her father's funeral, and discussing the inheritance? I don't want someone like that representing our company. I'll have to think about your position. CEO, please, wait. Stanley tried to stop him, but the CEO came to me and smiled kindly. You've done well. From now on, live your life for yourself. Thank you. These were the first kind words I heard since Henry's passing. I looked down and started crying, and he watched over me. I overstepped, didn't I, Sophia? If you ever need a job, let me know. We are hoping for someone like you to return. With that, the man left. He had often visited Henry, which led to many conversations with me. During this time, he told me that even though he was the CEO, he cared about me. He revealed that even when I was working at the company, he had always watched my performance. And when he knew I was leaving due to marriage, he sincerely hoped I would do well. Knowing that someone cared for me without my knowledge made me incredibly happy. It pushed me to keep going. Wait a minute! That will is probably fake, isn't it? Stanley stood dumbfounded, and Elise, not to be outdone, began complaining. No, it's genuine. There was a lawyer present at its creation. Should I call them if you're dissatisfied? The mention of a lawyer silenced Elise, perhaps convincing her it was true. Oh, and one more thing. I'm going to claim compensation from you two. Why? We didn't do anything. It's because you did nothing. You left all the caregiving for Henry and raising Nancy to me. Elise and Stanley protested, claiming it was untrue and unfair. Seeing that the conversation wasn't progressing, I took Nancy's hand, still staring blankly. Shall we go? I smiled at her, and she nodded energetically. Okay. Relieved. A smile I hadn't seen 20 years ago. Holding my dear daughter's hand, we left the house that had bound us for so long. After that, Stanley and I divorced. I had recorded his words at the funeral with a voice recorder, which made the divorce smooth. Henry left the house to me, but it was filled with both precious and painful memories. After discussing with Nancy, we decided to sell it, feeling sorry to Henry, and used the money to buy a new home for us. We received a considerable inheritance, so we saved some for our future and spent time designing our new home. It wasn't that Henry's house was bad, but our new home felt more suitable for us. Afterward, Stanley, stripped of the house's ownership, had to move with Elise to a dilapidated apartment. Following the CEO's announcement, he was forced to leave his job and now lives modestly with a small income. Elise, already quite old, quickly deteriorated in the harsh environment. With no money for home health aid, Stanley is trying hard to care for her. To make matters worse, I claimed compensation from Stanley and Elise. Actually, following Henry's suggestion, I kept a voice recorder on me at all times, so I was able to record all the verbal abuse Elise and Stanley spewed at me as evidence. With such solid evidence, my lawyer said I could claim a little more than the usual amount in compensation. As I expected, Stanley and Elise were struggling to make ends meet, let alone pay the compensation. Desperately caring for Elise, Stanley was working tirelessly at convenience stores, supermarkets, and even construction sites at night, barely sleeping. Well, Stanley still has his physical strength, so he'll probably earn enough from labor-intensive jobs to pay off the compensation before he dies. On our side, Nancy has changed completely since we first met. She now affectionately calls me Mom. She's become so good at housework, I sometimes think she might be a better cook than me. When you become a grandma, Mom, I'll take care of you. After all, I could take care of Grandpa. Honestly, I had reservations about leaving my old age care to my only daughter, especially since we're not blood related. But when she said that, the tension I always felt eased, and I found myself crying. Nancy stroked my back. "You'll be fine, Mom," and gently said, "My daughter, the cutest in the world, the pride of my life, who cares for me more than anyone. A daughter so kind I could never feel embarrassed by her anywhere. And today I'm witnessing a special day for Nancy. Thank you for everything, Mom," she says with a smile. At her earnest request, I have the honor of walking my lovely daughter down the aisle to her groom. Arm in arm with the most beautiful Nancy, we walk down the aisle. The man waiting for her at the altar with his charming smile and kindness, "Please, let me make Nancy happy for life," had pleaded with me on the day he proposed to her. I still remember it vividly. After 20 long years, through so many hardships, I had the fortune of meeting my lovely daughter, witnessing her in her finest moment, and being there to see her off. I am the happiest mother in the world.